They say memory is a library, orderly and categorized, but mine is a scrapyard. It is a heap of rusted iron, tangled wire, and the smell of wet wool. Sometimes, when the weather turns in my knees, I can't tell if I am remembering the war or just a nightmare I had 40 years ago. But I know the cold was real. That specific, biting dampness that didn't just sit on your skin, but worked its way into the marrow, turning your bones into ice shards. It was October, I think, 1943, the mud of Lenino. But before the mud, there was the steel. I was sitting in the driver's bucket of the T-34, my knees drawn up to my chest. To this day, I cannot sit in a comfortable chair without feeling guilty. The seat was nothing more than a slab of metal with a thin pad that had long since given up the ghost. The engine behind me, that massive V2 diesel heart, was idling low, a guttural vibration that shook the fillings in my teeth. It was a beast, that tank. They called it a marvel of engineering. But to a man who had spent his life before the war tuning the delicate, rhythmic looms of the Lodz textile mills, it felt like a tractor designed by a drunkard. In the factory, there was a logic to the noise. The shuttle flew. The reed beat the weft, the harness rose and fell. Click-clack hummed. It was a conversation. You could hear a loose bolt 3 aisles away because it broke the harmony. You could fix it. You could stop the line, grease the bearing, and order would be restored. That was my life. I was a fixer of things. I understood that if you treated a machine with respect, it gave you production. But here inside this iron coffin, the logic was twisted. We were inside a machine built for the sole purpose of destroying other machines and being destroyed in turn. I ran my gloved hand over the steering lever. It was rough, the weld marks sloppy. Russian production. Hurried, desperate. I pulled a rag from my pocket. It smelled of rancid oil and the cheap, harsh tobacco. We rolled into newspaper and began to wipe a smear of grease from the instrument panel. It was a nervous tick. If I could clean it, I could control it. If I could control it, maybe I wouldn't die. Above my head, a bolt securing the driver's hatch was weeping. The interior of the tank was sweating, the heat of the engine clashing with the freezing dawn outside. A single drop of water formed on the rusted head of the bolt. I watched it grow heavy, swelling until gravity tore it loose. It hit the rim of my helmet, a dull hollow tap. I waited. Another drop formed. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3, tab. It was maddening. It was the sound of time running out. With every drop, I found myself back in the tavern in Lodz, listening to a one-armed man named Bolek telling stories of the Blitzkrieg in '39. He hadn't lost his arm to a bullet. He had lost it trying to pry open a hatch that the heat had fused shut. He told us with a wet, wheezing laugh that a tank is just a skillet on tracks. You don't die from the shell, Janek, he had whispered, his breath sour with vodka. You die because the fuel lines run through the fighting compartment. You die because when the steel buckles, the hatch jams. You cook. You sit there and you cook. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing the image of Bolek's scarred stump out of my mind. I tried to replace it with the factory floor, the smell of raw cotton, the sunlight filtering through the dust motes in the high windows. But the smell of diesel was too strong. It coated the back of my throat like a layer of fat. The claustrophobia was a physical weight, sitting on my chest. The armor plate in front of me was 45 millimeters thick, sloped to deflect death, but from the inside, it just felt like the lid of a tomb. I was 22 years old. I was supposed to be repairing looms. I was supposed to be walking a girl home along Piotrkowska Street. I wasn't supposed to be encased in 30 tons of Soviet steel, waiting to burn. The radio headset clamped over my ears crackled, a burst of static that sounded like tearing canvas. The voice that cut through was tinny and distorted, stripped of humanity by the vacuum tubes. Eagle 1 to all units. Advance. I repeat, advance. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a heroic cry for Poland. It was just a procedure, a work order. My body moved before my mind accepted it. That was the training. The fear was a frantic bird trapped in my ribcage, fluttering against my heart, but my hands were steady. They were mechanics' hands, They knew the throw of the lever, the resistance of the pedal. I kicked the clutch, the heavy spring fighting back against my boot, and shoved the gearshift forward. The transmission screamed, metal grinding against metal, before the teeth caught. The beast lurched. It didn't roll. It stumbled forward, the tracks biting into the frozen earth. Through the narrow slit of the driver's periscope, the world was a grainy, bouncing strip of gray. We broke through the tree line, the branches whipping against the hull, sounding like skeletal fingers trying to hold us back. The morning fog parted, shredded by our movement. And there it was, the Valley of Death, a scarred, desolate expanse of mud and craters leading toward the Lenino heights. In the distance, the earth erupted. A silent blossom of black dirt and fire rose into the air, followed seconds later by the dull, heavy concussion that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet. The line had started. The factory was open for business. We rolled into the gray soup. The engine roared, a constant, deafening demand for more fuel. More air, more speed. In the factory, speed was efficiency. Here, speed was survival, yet the mud of the Miria River Valley had other ideas. It was a slurry of swamp and clay that sucked at the tracks, trying to drag us down into the earth before the Germans even had a chance to shoot us. "Keep her moving, Jan. For God's sake, don't stall." The commander's voice in my ear was high-pitched, laced with the same panic I was swallowing. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was listening to the machine. I was listening to the pitch of the V2 engine, waiting for that subtle strain that meant the torque was dropping. My world narrowed down to the tachometer, and the view slit. The logic of the mechanic took over. In a loom, if the tension is too high, the thread snaps. Here, if I pushed the engine too hard in this muck, a track pin would shear. If a track pin sheared, we stopped. If we stopped, we were a stationary target, a skillet on a stove. I feathered the throttle, fighting the terrain. The tank slid sideways, the rear end drifting like a drunk on ice, before the grousers caught purchase and jerked us straight. To my left, through the periscope, I saw the shadowy shape of another T-34, number 212. We were moving in a wedge, a phalanx of steel. Seeing them gave me a moment of comfort. We were not alone. We were a regiment, a force. Then the physics of war asserted themselves. There was no warning, no whistle of an incoming shell. Just a sudden, violent change in the atmosphere. A line of tracer fire, green and malevolent, whipped past my vision block. Then, a streak of white light slammed into the side of tank 212. It didn't look like an explosion in a newsreel. It looked like a physics experiment gone wrong. The impact point glowed incandescent white for a fraction of a second, brighter than the sun. Then the laws of thermodynamics took their payment. The ammunition inside 212 detonated. The turret, 5 tons of cast steel, lifted into the air. It spun lazily, almost gracefully, riding a column of vertical fire that jetted from the hull like a blowtorch. Black, oily smoke billowed instantly, blotting out the sky. I watched, paralyzed for a heartbeat. The machine I trusted, the steel I relied on, had just been turned into an oven in the blink of an eye. I knew the men inside. I knew the driver, a boy from Warsaw who played the harmonica. There was no time for them to scream, no time to open a hatch. They were just gone, erased by a chemical reaction. Hard right, anti-tank gun at 2 o'clock. The gunner's scream tore through my headset, shattering the shock. I hauled on the right steering lever with both hands, my muscles straining. The hydraulic assist was sluggish. The tank slewed around, the tracks churning up a wall of mud. The world outside dissolved into a cacophony of violence. The muffled thud of our own 76 gun firing sent a shockwave back through the chassis, filling the fighting compartment with the acrid, bitter taste of cordite. Spent shell casings clattered onto the floor steel, heavy brass bones. The coaxial machine gun chattered continuously, a jackhammer drilling into my skull. I was no longer Jan, the factory worker. I was a component. I was the servo motor that turned the tracks. I was the pump that fed the fuel. My fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was buried under the frantic necessity of action. We crested a small rise, the engine screaming in protest. The suspension bottomed out with a bone-jarring crash as we slammed down on the other side. Target identified. High explosive fire. The tank rocked backward as the main gun roared again. Then the universe ended. It wasn't a sound. It was a pressure. A monstrous sledgehammer blow struck the front glacis plate directly in front of me. The tank didn't just stop. It was thrown. The 30-ton beast was slapped sideways by the kinetic energy of an armor-piercing round. My head slammed into the periscope housing. A shower of sparks cascaded down from the instrument panel. The interior lights died instantly, plunging us into a gloom illuminated only by the terrifying orange flicker of something burning beneath the dashboard. The air filled instantly with smoke, not the exhaust smoke but the sharp, stinging chemical stench of burning insulation and vaporized metal. The smell of the factory fire. The smell of the trap. My ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the engine. I couldn't feel my legs. I reached for the hatch release, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps of poisoned air. "Bail out! Bail out!" someone was screaming, but the voice sounded miles away, underwater. I looked down. The darkness around my feet was glowing. The fire was here. The heat was not a temperature. It was a physical weight, a crushing blanket that wrapped around my throat and squeezed. The darkness wasn't empty. It was filled with the chaotic, strobe light flickering of a fire that had already begun to consume the floorboards. I tried to inhale, but the air had been replaced by a thick, oily smog that tasted of sulfur and melting rubber. It coated my tongue like tar. I was coughing violent, racking spasms that bent me double, my eyes streaming tears that boiled on my cheeks before they could fall. I looked up, wiping the grime from my eyes. The turret, usually a place of disciplined machinery, was now a cage of shadows and erratic, dancing light. Pieter was slumped over the 76-gun breech. He looked like a marionette whose strings had been cut. His left leg was twisted at an angle that made my stomach turn, pinned beneath the recoil guard. He wasn't moving. "Pieter," I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the flames rising from the engine compartment behind us. The firewall was breached. The beast was eating itself. I scrambled up the transmission casing, my boots slipping on the slick hydraulic fluid that covered the floor. I slammed my shoulder against the main turret hatch. It should have swung open. It should have been my door to the gray sky. But it was locked solid. The kinetic energy of the shell impact had warped the turret ring, twisting the steel frame just enough to fuse the hatch to the hull. The metal had flowed like wax and hardened into a tomb. I pushed until stars danced in the periphery of my vision, until the veins in my neck felt like they would burst. The hatch didn't budge. It didn't even groan. It was part of the armor now. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the heat. I dropped back down, gasping for air that wasn't there. My eyes darted to the front of the compartment, the driver's hatch. My hatch, it was untouched. The mechanism was simple. I could see the latch. It was clear. The path was open. I could drop down, crawl out, and roll into the cooling mud of the battlefield. I could be breathing fresh air in 3 seconds. I could live. Pieter groaned. It was a low, wet sound, bubbling up through the blood in his lungs. The fire in the engine compartment roared louder. A hungry, rushing sound as the diesel lines ruptured. The ammunition racks were lining the walls. I knew the timing. I knew the mechanics of combustion. I had worked with machines my whole life. I knew exactly how long it took for heat to travel through steel to a primer. I had seconds, maybe 10, maybe less. I looked at the open driver's hatch. It was a tunnel of light. Then I looked at Pieter. He was motionless, trapped in the rising inferno. I was a factory worker from Lodz. I was not a hero. I was a man who punched a clock and oiled gears. But I knew how metal behaved. You don't fight it with strength. You fight it with leverage. My desperate eyes scanned the floor, searching through the debris of spent shell casings and shattered glass. There, the engine crank handle. a heavy, solid bar of iron used for manual starting. It had been kicked loose in the impact. I grabbed it. The metal was searing hot, having lain near the firewall. I didn't feel the pain. I didn't have time for pain. I jammed the flat, chiseled end of the crank into the warped seam of the turret hatch, searching for a purchase in the twisted steel. I found a lip, a millimeter of space between the hatch and the rim. I wedged it in. I braced my boots against the ammo rack, ignoring the heat radiating from the shells. I grabbed the end of the iron bar with both hands. I hung my entire body weight on the lever. The hinge groaned. The high, tearing sound of stressed steel fighting against physics. The smoke was a blindfold now, absolute and suffocating. I couldn't see my hands. I could only feel the vibration of the fire beneath me, the trembling of the dying tank. The crank slipped. The iron handle slammed downward, losing its bite on the rim. My momentum carried me forward, and the jagged edge of the hatch mechanism sliced across my palm. It wasn't a cut. It was a gouge. Blood, hot and slick, instantly coated the handle. I fell back against the gun breech, gasping, clutching my hand. I stared at the driver's hatch. It was still there, still open. Just go. The voice in my head was screaming. Just go. Pieter is dead. He has to be. You can't save him. Save yourself. Pieter whispered something then. A name. Maybe his mother. Maybe God. It was barely a breath, but it cut through the roar of the fire louder than any explosion. I looked at the blood dripping from my hand. I looked at the fire curling around the turret ring. I was terrified. I was a child in the dark, but I was a mechanic, and this machine would not beat me. I wiped my bleeding hand on my tunic, smearing red into the rough wool. I grabbed the crank again. My grip was slippery, weak. I gritted my teeth so hard I felt a molar crack. I jammed the lever back into the steel wound. Deeper this time. I found the purchase. I didn't think. I didn't pray. I just pulled. I put every ounce of fear, every ounce of anger, every hour of labor I had ever worked into that bar of iron. I screamed. It wasn't a word. It was raw sound tearing from my throat. There was a crack loud and sharp as a gunshot. The metal shrieked in defeat. The hatch flew back, banging violently against the outer armor. The sky, the gray, beautiful, smoke-choked sky. I didn't pause to look at it. I grabbed Pieter by his harness. He was dead weight, a sack of grain, heavy and limp. I heaved, my back muscles screaming in protest. I dragged him up over the lip of the turret, struggling for traction on the smooth steel. We fell. We didn't climb down. We tumbled off the hull, hitting the wet earth hard. Move, move, I choked out, though I doubt he heard me. I grabbed his collar and scrambled on hands and knees, dragging him through the slush, away from the heat, away from the ticking bomb. The mud was cold, freezing against my burned skin. It was the best thing I had ever felt. We made the shell crater, a scar in the earth filled with brackish water, just as the world disintegrated. The ammunition cooked off. It wasn't an explosion. It was the end of existence for that patch of ground. The turret was tossed into the air like a toy, spinning lazily before crashing down. A wave of heat rolled over us, solid and punchy, singing the hair on the back of my neck. I pressed my face into the wet, freezing mud, shielding Pieter with my body. I lay there, shaking, listening to the secondary explosions, feeling the earth tremble against my chest. That was a lifetime ago. I sit in my apartment in Lodz now. The walls are covered in wallpaper that is peeling at the corners. It is quiet here, but I look at my hands. They are old hands, spotted with age, the skin thin like parchment, but the scar is still there. A white, jagged line running right across my palm. It never tanned. It never faded. I reach into the drawer of my bedside table. I pull out a piece of metal. It is a bent, rusted iron rod. The crank handle. I went back for it. Days later. I don't know why. People ask me about the war. They ask about the strategy, the generals, the liberation. They want to hear about glory. They don't ask about the smell. I can't go into garages anymore. The smell of burning oil, of hot grease. It paralyzes me. I see the fire. I feel the smoke in my lungs. I was a factory worker. My job was to build things, to make the gears turn and the pistons fire in harmony. I thought the world was a machine that could be fixed if you just had the right tool and enough leverage. I thought we could repair what was broken. But that day, inside the burning steel, I learned the truth. The machine is broken. It cannot be repaired. The gears are ground to dust. The industry of killing broke the mechanism of the world. I never went back to the factory. I couldn't stand the noise of the presses. It sounded too much like the hatch giving way. It sounded like the tank dying. War is not an epic story. It is a small, dark space. It is a friend bleeding out beside you. It is the choice you make when you are choking on smoke and the exit is right there, whispering your name. It is the decision to stay when every survival instinct in your DNA screams to run. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.